The vanishing case that terrified investigators. The first call landed at 9:12 p.m. on a drizzly Thursday along Highway 22, where the road slips past the dark water of Detroit Lake and into the timber that locals simply call the Ridge. The caller's voice was steady, then it wasn't. "My name is Evan Mercer," he said, breath shallow like he'd just jogged. "I pulled over at the mile marker with the broken green sign, the one with the bullet holes. There's... Hold on," Static hissed. A soft scrape, like a jacket sleeve, brushed against the phone. "There's someone in the trees. They're not moving right. They're not walking, they're not." The line crackled, then went silent for 3 long seconds. When the dispatcher asked him to repeat, Evan said, "Quieter. If I don't answer in a minute, please send someone. Please hurry." The call ended with a wet clicking sound, as if a tongue tapped the microphone, and nothing more. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Patrol car 3 King 7 reached the pullout at 9:27 p.m. and found an old F-150 idling with the driver's door ajar. The overhead light was on, and a thermos steamed faintly in the cup holder. A phone lay face down on the passenger seat, recording a 9-minute voice memo that the deputy, a calm woman named Lena Alvarez, downloaded on the spot. Her body camera caught everything. The first minute was just engine, rain, and a bright pulsing hum too low to be a siren. The rest was the sound of the forest taking slow breaths. Detective Rowan Hale arrived from the county office at 10:04 p.m., the kind of investigator who carried a metal tape measure and wrote times down to the second. He stood in the beam of his cruiser, a pale rectangle of light on wet asphalt, and listened to the lake pushing softly at the rocky shore below. Pines crowded the slope, black spears against a wool sky. The smell of hot engine blended with a sharp metallic odor, like a coin pressed hard to the tongue. "Mercer?" he called. The trees said nothing. They found footprints immediately. Evan stepped out of his truck in work boots, size 11, crossing the gravel shoulder toward the tree line. The rain softened the edges, but every other detail was crisp. Heel, arch, toe. Then the prints did something that made both investigators forget to breathe for a beat. They simply ended. Not faded, not scuffed away, stopped. The last print lay in the gravel mid-stride, the tiny stones within it undisturbed, as if the boot had pressed into powder that wasn't there, lifted, and left no next step. "Could be," he hopped, Deputy Alvarez whispered, not believing it. "Where to?" Hale said, and lifted his flashlight. The beam scanned the wet trunks. 10 feet in, a birch peeled a silver ribbon of bark. Farther back, the forest went so dark, the light seemed to fall into it. No dragging marks, no sliding mud, no impression of knees or hands, just the last step and the next step missing. At 10:22 p.m., the tow truck driver, a night owl named Beasley, who moved like he was always recovering from the last thing he saw, holstered his gloves and crossed himself when he looked at the prints. He said it without looking at the woods. "This place eats things." The search started by 11. State troopers, county volunteers, 2 SAR handlers with dogs, one named Gipper, the other Foxy, both usually eager to barrel into brush. They took one sniff of the air and sat. Not frightened exactly, braced, as if whatever their noses told them was both confusing and beneath their notice. When the handlers coaxed them forward, the dogs went a few yards into the trees, stopped at the last footprint, and stared at a point 3 feet above the ground, tails flat, heads tilted in the same uncanny angle as if they were listening to something no one else could hear. At 12:17 a.m., a deputy radioed a report of dim white lights flickering deeper in the trees. Hale and Alvarez pushed in to check. What they found was stranger than flashlights. 3 lengths of mylar, the kind used for emergency blankets, were snagged high on branches and rustled as the wind shifted. Their reflective surfaces shivered with every gust, throwing off weak glints like eyes. But there were no footprints beneath the trees they hung from, no sign anyone had climbed to place them. Hale measured the height with his stick. The lowest strip was more than 10 feet up. They set a perimeter anyway. They marked the last print with a yellow tent labeled A. The truck was taken back to the county lot by 1:05 a.m. Its cabin still warm, its radio presets set to classic rock, and a local AM station that would rattle with a sports talk show at noon. A coffee receipt in the cup holder said 8. 41 Pendemen, Cedar Mart, 2 miles east in the town of Gray Ridge. Population stitched together by the mill and the lake. The cashier on duty, a college kid named Jude, remembered Evan saying he needed caffeine for the drive back to Salem. He remembered Evan glancing toward the door as if someone had just passed by the glass. He looked spooked, Jude said at 1:53 a.m., sitting in a back office under buzzing fluorescent lights, steam rising from his instant noodles. Like when you see your reflection move the wrong way. The next morning broke flat and gray. The mountains wore a low band of cloud, the kind that never quite lifts. The wider team assembled at a trailhead with paper cups of donated coffee and stale sugar donuts, then fanned out in grids. That was when the first investigator said out loud that something about the place felt wrong. It wasn't superstition, it was a physical sensation, the way you notice silence only when it feels like weight. They kept finding things that should have belonged to Evan, except they couldn't prove they did. A key on a ring with no car fob wedged in moss. A strip of duct tape stuck to a rock, perfectly smooth as if it had never touched anything. A silver coin embedded in the mud so deeply that the date stamped on it had been polished smooth by grinding it against nothing. They also found a smear on a tree, low and oval and faintly oily to the touch, like a thumbprint the size of a dinner plate. The lab in Salem would later say it contained petroleum byproducts, cedar pollen, and something else not identified in their standard panel. The technician who gave that report sniffed and said the something else was probably an environmental contaminant, which was the exact phrasing a person uses when they want to be done thinking about what they touched. At 2:03 p.m., Alvarez went into the grocery on Main Street to talk to a woman named Mara Ellison, who held a paper cup in both hands as if she were trying to warm bone. He texted me at 8:47, she said, passing over her phone with the threads. The message read, "I'm fine, just grabbed coffee. The lake's got that weird low fog. It sits like it's thinking." Then at 9:06, "There's a green sign. Wind is kicking up. I hear something and then nothing else." She had called at 9:20 when he didn't answer. "He doesn't ghost me," she said, and the way she said it told them everything. Hale asked what Evan did for work. He managed a small warehouse, took weekend trips to fish, paid his bills on time, kept a list in his phone of guitar chords that sounded good after midnight. He wasn't running from anyone. He wasn't trying to disappear. He had a dent in his truck door that he still hadn't fixed because he said it made the truck look honest. He laughed at bad jokes and bought extra firewood for friends at campouts. That evening, he'd been headed home from a helper job at a friend's cabin on the far side of the lake. A normal day, nothing magic in it until it was. The traffic camera at mile marker 142 was an old unit bolted to a leaning pole, its feed flowing into a state server that an IT tech in Salem could pull within minutes. At 4:11 p.m., Hale and Alvarez sat in a dim room at the sheriff's office while the techs scrubbed back and forth across a sliver of time. 9:19 p.m. showed the edge of Evan's truck. 19:41 showed the door opening. At 9:19:52, a tall figure stepped into frame. At the bottom edge of the image, head bent, shoulders bunched against rain. At 19:57, every pixel on the screen seemed to drag left by a hair as if the world had been pulled in a single direction and then let go. It wasn't a full glitch, the time code didn't skip, the sound didn't break. It looked like heat shimmer but there was no heat. A moment later, the figure was gone. "Frame drop," the tech said, and then frowning, "except it isn't." He tapped keys, there's no missing data, the codec logged a continuous packet stream. He didn't like saying that. Sometimes these older units get interference. He made a show of checking for lightning strikes that never happened and solar activity that wasn't present either. When he left, the small room smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee, and Hale wrote the time down again, because writing times was how he kept a grip on what the world was supposed to do. The word for what the case did to investigators began as tired jokes. Maybe we should start charging the ghosts rent. By the third night, nobody joked. The third night was when Alvarez lost 41 seconds. It was 2:13 a.m. when she walked alone down the shoulder of the highway, past the pullout, body cam glowing a neat blue bead in the dark. The rain had thinned to mist that glittered in her beam. She narrated for the record the way they are trained. Alvarez walking southbound, wind negligible, pavement wet, no vehicles, audible lake wash to my left, smell of cedar. It's cold. Then she stopped speaking because she heard it. The hum. It was not electricity, it was not a plane, it was the noise a taut cable makes when the wind plucks it. It vibrated in her teeth. Her beam swung once across the trees and came back to the road, and then the video blurred, not in a smear, but in a folding. The yellow center line ahead of her looked like a ribbon being drawn into the woods, little key stitches of paint bending toward the trunks and then releasing. She took one more step and had the sensation of putting her foot down into air that did not expect it. The video never cut, the timestamp never jumped, but her voice, steadily narrating, was gone for 41 full seconds, replaced by soft rooftops of sound like waves falling over a gravel bar. When the sound of her voice returned, she was saying, "No, I'm good, I'm right here," and her breath was hitching. She stood on the shoulder with her hands braced on her knees, and the night came back in layers, wind in the mylar strips, a truck rumbling faintly miles away. Her own pulse drumming so loud inside her ears, it sounded like someone knocking from the inside of a closet. "You okay?" Hale said, moving to her, and she nodded too fast. She wouldn't describe what she saw fully for a day. When she finally did, she said it in a low, even tone at the end of a long interview. "The road tilted," she said. "Not the pavement, not the earth, the place where you decide which way to step. It tilted toward the trees. If something wanted a clean line, it would wipe the line you chose, and you'd walk into where nothing has a step." The case file swelled with interviews, maps, lists. Hale added a page about an earlier disappearance that the old-timers mentioned only if you prompted them with dates. A logger named Kenner went missing in roughly the same stretch, back when the mill still paid cash at the end of the week and the tavern stayed open until sunrise. According to a man named Fielder, who kept a ledger of local deaths because the county clerk's office was a 50-minute drive, Kenner's truck had also been found idling with its lights on and his lunch pail still latched. The printout with an excerpt from that ledger became tab 23. In pencil, Hale wrote in the margin, "Pattern." By day 5, the search scaled down. It always does. People have jobs, fuel costs, the lake never stops pushing at the rocks, and even grief must sleep. Yet every night at 2-something in the morning, the AM band on the radio at the sheriff's office shivered into a non-signal, a dead station that rattled. When you turn the dial through it, the numbers 739 seemed to whisper past in sequence 3 or 4 times. Not a full voice, just a cadence. The repairs crew came in and tightened everything, and the sound came back anyway. Then, a small thing that got under everyone's skin. A janitor named Ruth found the chain from Evan's keyring lying on the tile in the hallway outside the evidence room one morning when she came in a few minutes before sunrise. It was the cheap kind of chain made of tiny balls. It had a small kink in it that Mara later said she recognized, and the link that would have held a fob was bent, as if someone had tried and failed to add a key in a hurry. The inventory log showed the keyring inside the sealed bag inside the locked cabinet. The bag weighed the same, looked the same, sat exactly where it should have been, and when they opened it, the chain was intact and the kink was where Mara remembered. The chain in the hall, same length, same feel, sat on Hale's desk in a small dish for the rest of the month, and people avoided looking at it because it was easier to pretend that kind of duplication belonged to a mistake. At 10:13 p.m. on day 7, a man drifting a small aluminum boat along the north shore of the lake called in a sighting. He said a white shape moved among the trees near the mile marker, a pale figure gliding parallel to the shore and then stopping. He rowed closer. The shape was a refrigerator box, flayed open on one side and flapping in the breeze, caught between trunks. When officers hauled it out, they found the inside lined with, of all things, pages from a guitar chord book glued into a collage of E minor and D7 and A4. Every page split and overlapped so that none of the chords formed a full diagram. The paper was dry. Hale wrote the time down anyway. He did not say anything about the list in Evan's phone of chords he liked after midnight. Night 9 was when it turned personal enough to break the last of the gallows humor. Hale woke in his room at the Cedar Motor Lodge at 2:16 a.m. to the soft hum. It vibrated the window glass. He sat up and put his feet on the carpet and felt the pressure in the air as if a storm were about to hit. The red numbers of the clock read 2:17. He stood, crossed to the sink, and turned on the tap for noise, then turned it off again because the water came out in staccato bursts like it was remembering how to be water. The chain on his door clicked once with no one touching it. He would not write that in the report because even he had a line he didn't want to cross. But he wrote the time, 2:18. He stared at the door long enough to hear the people next door whispering through thin drywall. A woman's voice said, "Don't say it out loud," and a man's voice said, "We didn't." By then, Gray Ridge's rumor mill was grinding full speed. The woman who ran the pie shop on Main told anyone who would listen that she had driven past that mile marker around 10 p.m. the week before and watched her dashboard clock stutter backward from 10, 7 to 10, 5, and then tick forward again like a skip in a record. A youth pastor from the church near the school said he'd hiked the ridge years ago and felt his legs tremble in a patch of sunlight that shouldn't have been there because the canopy was too dense. A retired surveyor named Orville talked about a singing wire he'd heard when he was a young man stringing telephone lines, the kind of sound that makes your fillings itch. He said the ridge had its own weather. He said not to whistle there at night. He said a lot of things, and then he said nothing at all and rocked gently on his heels. 2 weeks in, the official search scaled down again. The case file thickened with the weight of pages you only read when you have to. Hale kept going to the lake at night. He wore the same heavy jacket, ate the same vending machine granola bar, and wrote times as if each time could anchor a thing that didn't want to be held. At 1:59 a.m. On one of those nights, he measured the distance from the last print to the first tree 3 times and got 3 different numbers. Not different by much, by 1.5 inches, by 2 inches, by 9/16. The kind of differences that make you double-check your hands. He measured a length of rope along the shoulder, 250 feet, and when he rolled it back up, his hands were shaking so badly that the rope slipped, and he had to start again. When he measured it the second time, it was missing 11 inches. He cut a new piece from a fresh spool and measured again. 250 feet on the nose. He did not put the 11-inch short rope in the evidence room. He kept it in his trunk because he didn't want to know what the evidence room would do with it. On a quiet afternoon in the 3rd week, the county received a voicemail stamped with the date of the night Evan vanished and delivered by the network 3 weeks late. The message came to Mara's phone first, then was forwarded to the sheriff. It was short, wind in a speaker, the sound of a shoe scuffing gravel. A man's voice, breathless but not panicked, saying, "Do not step or you cannot hear your feet." and then a singular knock, as if a knuckle had tapped an empty wooden box. The line ended on a small intake of breath, cut clean. The carrier said towers sometimes backlog, messages sometimes float in the system, and there was nothing more they could explain. At 3:23 p.m., one day, a volunteer named Naomi Pike, who wrote about strange disappearances for a small website and had the polite eyes of someone who knows when she's not wanted, brought photocopies of old news clippings about the lake before it became the lake. Down Valley communities flooded. Whole stands of trees drowned when the dam closed and the water rose. Stoves and fence posts and tomato cages at the bottom of a mild, cold sea. One article quoted an older ranger, long dead now, muttering on record that the ridge made compasses slow. Naomi handed everything over without flourish and went back to her rental car. Her taillights glowed red against the rain as she pulled away, then dissolved into gray. The same afternoon, the state tech sent an email about the traffic camera feed saying he'd found tiny backlog in the buffer at 19 that night. A few extra kilobytes whispering through the stream. Nothing meaningful. Just noise. Harmless, he wrote. Artifact of packet repair. He added a smiley face. When Hale read that line, he stood abruptly, walked outside into the wind, and stood under the bare flagpole until the wind cut his eyes and he felt calmer. There were more calls at night. A man who swore he saw a figure standing in the shallow wash at the lake's edge, looking out at the black water. Both hands raised like he was warming them over a fire no one else could see. A pair of night fishermen who heard a voice say hello from just behind them and then repeat it in a lower octave, as if two throats had learned the word together. Two teenagers who parked at the pullout and joked loudly to keep brave until they noticed all the night insects had gone silent at once, as if a hand had pressed down on a switch, and they drove away so fast they forgot to switch on their headlight. Then, one more thing that turned the case from frightening to personal for the people wearing the badges. At 2:31 a.m., the day before the file was supposed to be transferred to a colder desk, Alvarez was typing up a supplemental when her monitor blinked black and came back with a blinking cursor inside a blank report she had not opened. The cursor jumped on its own. A single word appeared in the field where the case name should go. Here. Then nothing, and the monitor returned to her report as if she had never left it. She stared until the clock at the bottom corner ticked over to 2:33. She saved her report, closed the lid, and felt her throat press shut like a hand had rested around it. She signed off early and drove to the lake. She stopped 100 yards short of the pullout. She turned off her lights and sat in the dark, listening. She did not get out. She did not press record. She did not narrate. She did not breathe for a count of 4. After a minute, she heard the softest sound, like boot leather bending, as someone shifted their weight from one foot to the other. She thought, with sudden clarity, that the worst part of this job had never been the blood or the lies. It was the moments when you knew you were hearing something meant for you. By dawn, she made a decision. She told Hale 2 hours later, standing beside the coffee machine while it groaned out a thin stream. I can't do nights there anymore, she said. Not for a while. He nodded as if she had told him the sky had a color. He signed the form that moved her temporarily to day shifts and wrote the time, 10:21 a. He would tell his wife later that he had never been proud of a signature before. Officially, the Mercer case never reached a conclusion. The file thickened and then stopped. The press releases used phrases like pending new information and no evidence of foul play found at this time, which is what you write when every possibility has crawled under the bed to hide from daylight. People still drive past the green sign with the bullet holes, and at night they glance in their mirrors between mile markers 141 and 143 without knowing why. The strange part isn't how it ended. The strange part is how it kept touching things after it should have gone still. Months later, a family walking the shoreline in April found a sealed jar in a tangle of drift close to the pullout. Inside, folded tight, was a page torn neatly from a spiral notebook. The page was blank at first glance. Only when they tilted it toward the sun did they see faint writing impressed into the paper, as if someone had written on a page above it and the pressure left ghosts of letters. It read, in sharp, ordinary handwriting, "Never step where sound has left." The letters walked down the page and thinned at the end. The jar lid was on tight. There was no water inside. The family turned the jar in to the county without their names. The clerk who accepted it put it on a shelf to be logged after lunch. When she came back, the jar was gone, and in its place sat a silver coin pressed so clean you couldn't read the date. On some nights, if you tune your car radio to the broken AM station near the lake, the dial will tremble as you pass that stretch, and a low thrumming will pulse through the speakers like the space between heartbeats. A voice, maybe the same voice that warned the dispatcher, maybe not, will rise out of static for just a moment. You won't catch the words. You'll only feel your feet on the pedals, your hands on the wheel, and the peculiar awareness that you are crossing a place where the world forgets its lines. Keep driving. Keep your tires on the painted edge. Count out loud if you have to. Hear your step. And if you stop, if you ease onto the gravel and lower your window and listen, the night will offer you the gentle wash of the lake, the whisper of wind through fir needles, and that thin cable hum plucked by nothing human. You will think about a man who stepped toward the trees with his shoulders hunched against rain. You will look down and see your own footprint, clean in the grit, and you will see that there is a space ahead of it where the next print should go and does not. Your mind will fill the blank with stories, so you can move. Choose one, make it a good one, bring it with you as you turn back to the wheel. Drive. The ridge will watch you leave and fold the sound of your engine carefully away, as if it has been saving a quiet place for it all along. Some cases terrified because of what they show you. This one terrifies because of what it takes away, one step at a time, until the distance between footsteps becomes a place all its own. When the investigators finally closed their notebooks and turned off their recorders, the lake kept breathing. The ridge kept humming. And somewhere, just past the broken green sign, the last clear footprint in the gravel waited under a thin coat of dust for the next person who leaned too close to the line where the world forgets to make the next step. When ordinary nights turned into real-life nightmares, the evening had been calm, almost too calm, as if the world itself was holding its breath. It was late autumn, when the days shortened quickly and the cold crept in long before the sun had completely disappeared. The small town of Pine Hollow, tucked between stretches of woodland and winding rivers, was the kind of place where people locked their doors out of habit rather than fear. For years, nothing truly terrible had happened here, and that quiet sense of safety was exactly what made what followed so disturbing. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? On a Thursday night, just past 9, the streets were nearly empty. A few porch lights glowed faintly, and the sound of televisions drifted from living rooms where families settled in after dinner. The air smelled of damp leaves, and a thin mist curled along the edges of the forest that surrounded the town. It was on nights like this that people usually felt comfort in routine, yet beneath that surface calm, something unnatural was already stirring. At the edge of town stood a narrow road that led into the trees, a road most people avoided at night. Locals had stories about headlights flickering there or shadows darting between the trees when no one should have been around. On that particular night, a delivery driver heading home swore he saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. He slowed down, blinking his headlights, but when he drew closer, the figure had vanished. Shaken, he pulled over, convinced for a moment that his mind was playing tricks. But the mist was heavy, and as he sat there listening to the engine idle, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving across the asphalt. Yet, no one was there. Back in town, around the same time, a group of teenagers was gathered in the old baseball field near the high school. They were laughing, tossing around a football under the dim glow of the single floodlight that still worked. The grass was wet with dew, and the chill forced them to keep moving. One of them paused, looking toward the tree line. A faint, rhythmic knocking sound was coming from the woods. At first, they thought it was an animal. Then, the sound grew louder, more deliberate, like someone rapping wood against wood in a steady beat. They yelled into the darkness, expecting maybe another friend playing a prank, but the sound didn't stop. It moved closer, circling them, until the floodlight above suddenly flickered and went out. The field was swallowed by darkness, and in that instant, all of them ran. Later, when they told their parents, no one believed them. That same night, just after midnight, a young couple living in a small apartment above Main Street awoke to the sound of knocking on their door. At first, they ignored it, thinking it might be someone who had the wrong apartment. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew more insistent, louder, and then turned into pounding. The man grabbed a flashlight, went to the door, and called out, but no voice answered. He hesitated before looking through the peephole. What he saw made his stomach twist. There was no one there, yet the pounding continued, echoing through the hallway. Suddenly, the noise stopped, replaced by silence so complete it pressed against his ears. He opened the door cautiously, sweeping the flashlight across the empty hall. The bulb in the overhead light had burned out, and the shadows stretched long. He was about to step back inside when he noticed something smeared across the doorframe. A set of handprints, damp and dark, as though someone had pressed their palms into the wood. By dawn, the town felt different. People were whispering in cafes, parents were checking in on their children, and the sheriff's phone rang nonstop with reports of strange occurrences. Lights flickering in houses, voices heard in empty rooms, shadows appearing at the edge of vision. The sheriff himself, a man hardened by years of quiet service, tried to dismiss it all as coincidence, yet he too had woken in the night to find every clock in his house stopped at exactly 3:15. The following night, the atmosphere thickened, streetlights dimmed for no reason, radios filled with static, and dogs across Pine Hollow began to howl in unison. At the small gas station on the corner of Maple Street, the cashier was closing up when he heard what he thought was someone calling his name from the restroom. He checked, but the restroom was empty. When he returned to the counter, every shelf in the store had shifted, cans and bottles rearranged into patterns that looked like circles. He quit his job the very next morning. The town's sense of safety began to erode quickly. Parents kept their children indoors, doors were bolted, and even then, the nights became unbearable. People reported nightmares so vivid they woke up screaming, describing the same thing over and over. A tall shadow, faceless and thin, standing at the foot of their beds, waiting. Some said it whispered their names, others said it only stood in silence, yet all of them swore it was real. By the third night, the sheriff organized patrols, hoping that extra eyes on the streets would calm everyone down. But even his deputies admitted that strange things were happening. Radios cut out mid-transmission, squad cars stalled without explanation, and 2 officers swore they saw a figure crawling on all fours across the roof of a house before vanishing into the night. One of the most chilling events happened to a family on Cedar Lane. Just after 2 in the morning, their smoke alarm went off. The parents rushed through the house, searching for fire, but there was no smoke, no flames. Yet, when they entered their daughter's room, they found her standing by the window, wide awake, staring outside. When they asked what she was looking at, she pointed into the yard and said, "He's waiting." The parents looked, but saw nothing. Later, when they checked the yard in daylight, they found a set of footprints in the mud, leading up to the window, and then disappearing abruptly as though the figure had sunk into the earth. The nightmare spread, no one was spared. People reported hearing cries in the woods, whispers in their homes, and a constant feeling of being watched. Businesses closed early, church services filled with frightened families, and yet no explanation ever came. Scientists were called in from the city, trying to measure electromagnetic fields, looking for gas leaks, anything that might explain the mass hysteria. They left empty-handed, shaken themselves after spending one night in the town. One night, a heavy storm rolled through. Thunder shook the houses, rain hammered the rooftops, and the wind carried voices that seemed to call out from everywhere at once. Entire neighborhoods lost power. In that suffocating darkness, people saw things they would never forget. A woman walking her dog swore she saw dozens of pale hands pressing against the inside of her living room window, even though no one was inside. A truck driver passing through claimed he drove for nearly 20 miles without seeing another car, only to find the same broken-down vehicle appearing again and again on the roadside. By morning, Pine Hollow was not the same town. Ordinary nights had been replaced with nights of terror. People abandoned their homes, some never came back, and others stayed, but lived in constant fear. The sheriff eventually stopped taking reports, not because they stopped happening, but because there were too many. To this day, no one can explain what really descended on Pine Hollow. Some believe it was something ancient, tied to the land itself, awakened by chance. Others whisper it was a punishment, a darkness drawn to the town for reasons no one dares to speak. What remains are the memories, carved into the minds of those who lived through it, reminders that sometimes the most ordinary nights can twist into real-life nightmares, leaving scars that time cannot erase. And if you ever find yourself passing through Pine Hollow on a foggy night, with the streetlights flickering and the woods pressing close, you might feel it too, that sense of being watched. Perhaps you'll hear footsteps following your own, or a faint knock that seems to echo in your bones. And if you do, don't linger too long, because what once came for Pine Hollow may be waiting still, hidden in the mist, ready to turn another ordinary night into something you'll never forget. A murder mystery too twisted to solve. It was late evening when the wind began to stir through the quiet streets of a small town in northern America. The sky was heavy with clouds, the moon only occasionally breaking through, casting pale light over the narrow roads. In the distance, the sound of a church bell echoed faintly, almost swallowed by the cold air. At that very moment, no one realized that something dreadful was about to unfold, something that would haunt investigators and residents alike for years to come. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? The town was the kind of place where everyone believed they knew each other. Houses stood close together, with porches that looked out toward empty sidewalks. Street lamps flickered as if struggling to keep their glow alive. It was just after 10 p.m. when the local police received a call that changed everything. A neighbor, shaken and out of breath, reported screams coming from the house at the corner of Willow Street. The screams were sharp, desperate, and then, suddenly, they stopped. When the first patrol car arrived, the neighborhood was already on edge. Curtains shifted, doors cracked open, and uneasy faces peeked out. The house in question stood silent, its front porch lights swinging in the wind as if someone had passed under it in a hurry. Officers knocked on the door but received no answer. After a tense moment, they forced their way inside. The interior of the house felt wrong immediately. A faint smell of iron filled the air, unmistakably metallic. The living room was dim, the lamp knocked over, casting eerie shadows across the walls. A half-finished cup of coffee still sat on the table, steam long gone, as if someone had been interrupted mid-sip. In the kitchen, chairs were overturned, one of them broken at the leg. And then, in the hallway, they found it. A body lying face down, blood pooled beneath. The victim had been struck repeatedly, the brutality suggesting rage more than intention. What made it all the more disturbing was the detail that none of the doors or windows had been forced open. Whoever did this had either been let inside willingly or was already in the house. By midnight, detectives were swarming the scene. One of them, a seasoned investigator who had seen his share of violence, admitted quietly that this case felt different, darker somehow. The victim's belongings were untouched, wallet and jewelry left behind, ruling out robbery. A series of photographs were discovered scattered on the floor, showing the victim with various friends and family. Yet, one photo stood out. It had been ripped in half, the missing piece showing only a shadow where another person had once been. The autopsy revealed something that sent chills even deeper. The injuries did not match a single weapon. It looked as though multiple methods had been used, almost ritualistic in nature. The coroner's report mentioned hesitation wounds, as if the killer had changed their mind halfway through, then continued with even greater force. As the investigation widened, the neighbors began sharing fragments of strange experiences. One elderly woman said she had noticed a tall figure standing across the street several nights in a row, unmoving, watching the house, disappearing before she could call anyone. Another resident swore they heard footsteps in their backyard at odd hours, though no one was ever found. Police combed through hours of surveillance footage from nearby stores and traffic lights, but something bizarre kept happening. Whenever the suspect might have appeared on camera, the footage glitched. Frames skipped, figures blurred into unrecognizable smears, as though the very image resisted being captured. Weeks passed, and suspicion fell on several people close to the victim. Friends, colleagues, even distant relatives were interrogated. Secrets began surfacing, revealing hidden grudges, financial troubles, and long-buried conflicts. But every lead seemed to collapse into nothing. Alibis checked out, motives were plausible but not conclusive, and physical evidence pointed in conflicting directions. The case grew colder, but the town itself did not rest easy. Strange calls began flooding the local police line. Residents reported hearing screams at night coming from empty lots. Others claimed they saw fleeting shadows darting across windows when no one was inside. Children woke crying, telling their parents they saw someone standing at the foot of their bed, someone tall with eyes that seemed hollow. Detectives tried to dismiss these claims as fear spreading in a shaken community, but even they could not deny what was happening during interviews. On more than one occasion, while questioning potential witnesses, the lights in the room flickered violently, and audio recorders captured faint whispers that no one present had spoken. The words were never clear, but one phrase repeated often enough to be noticed: "You can't find me." In one of the most unsettling turns, the original 911 call from the neighbor was revisited. When replayed, investigators realized that beneath the frantic voice, another sound lingered faintly. A whisper, distorted, almost laughing. Yet when the audio was enhanced, the voice vanished, replaced by static, as though the tape itself refused to give away its secret. By now, the community was spiraling into paranoia. People locked their doors earlier, kept lights on through the night, and avoided walking alone. Yet the sense of being watched persisted. Some swore they saw a figure in reflective surfaces, in mirrors and dark windows, a presence that always seemed one step out of reach. Despite the chilling atmosphere, the police continued piecing together what they could. A breakthrough seemed near when a small, blood-stained note was discovered in the lining of the victim's coat. The handwriting was jagged, the ink smeared, but it carried a single sentence that unsettled everyone who read it. It said simply, "You will never understand." This note sparked endless theories. Some believed the killer was mocking investigators. Others thought it was the victim's desperate attempt to leave a clue. But the handwriting matched no one in their circle, not even remotely. Months turned into years, and the case officially remained unsolved. Yet the file stayed open on the desks of those who worked it, haunting them like an unfinished puzzle. Detectives admitted privately that they sometimes dreamed of the crime scene, waking drenched in sweat, certain they had seen the shadow of the killer standing in their own bedroom. Even today, the house on Willow Street remains empty. The curtains are drawn, the yard overgrown, the structure slowly decaying. People avoid walking past it, crossing to the other side of the road. Children dare each other to step onto the porch, but rarely make it past the first stair. Those who do swear they feel a crushing heaviness in their chest, as though the house itself rejects their presence. Local folklore has grown around the case, transforming the murder into something larger, something darker. They say the killer was never meant to be caught, that it was less a person and more a force, something that feeds on confusion and fear. Others insist the victim themselves was not innocent, that secrets buried in that house led to an ending too twisted for the living to fully grasp. Whatever the truth may be, the murder mystery remains unsolved, and perhaps that is the most terrifying part. Because in the silence of that house, in the flicker of those failing street lamps, and in the restless dreams of those who remember, something still lingers, waiting, watching, daring anyone to try and unravel what cannot be explained. And each time the wind passes through the broken windows of Willow Street, carrying with it a low and hollow whistle, the town is reminded that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, some truths are too twisted to face, and some killers may still be out there unseen, yet never gone. The town that hid its darkest secret. The road into the small town was always quiet at night. A narrow strip of cracked asphalt cutting through endless fields of corn that swayed beneath the pale glow of the moon. Travelers who passed by would often remark how the place seemed frozen in time, as though the decades had moved on everywhere else but here. The welcome sign, chipped and leaning slightly to the right, greeted visitors with fading letters declaring the name of the town proudly, though few outsiders ever stopped long enough to remember it. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? It was just past midnight when the first unsettling incident began. A thin mist rolled in from the nearby river, curling low against the ground and weaving between the wooden houses that lined the main street. Most of the town was asleep, curtains drawn tight, doors locked, as though the residents all shared the same unspoken understanding that nothing good ever happened after dark. On the far edge of town, a lone diner sat glowing beneath buzzing neon lights. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and fried food. A handful of locals sat scattered across the booths, their conversations hushed, eyes occasionally drifting toward the wide windows that looked out into the night. The bell above the door rang, and for a moment, the entire diner fell silent. A man stepped in, his face pale and clothes damp, as though he had walked straight through the mist itself. Without speaking, he slid into a booth near the back, his trembling hands clasped around a worn leather bag. The waitress, a middle-aged woman who had worked there her whole life, poured him coffee without asking. She glanced down at the bag, then back at his face, and for the briefest moment, her expression hardened, as if she recognized something no one else could. She leaned close, whispering words too low for anyone else to hear, and the man nodded slowly. Whatever passed between them left the other customers uneasy. They pretended to focus on their meals, but the tension in the room was undeniable. At 3 a.m, the church bell rang once, though no one had pulled the rope. The sound carried across the town, deep and hollow, waking those who had been resting fitfully in their beds. Curtains were parted, lights flicked on, and whispers spread through the night air like sparks in dry grass. The bell was never supposed to ring at that hour, not since the tragedy that had taken place long ago. People knew it, and yet no one dared step outside to check. By dawn, the mist had lifted, but unease clung to the town like a shadow. Children walked to school with their parents close by, every set of eyes watching the empty church tower at the center of town. The man from the diner was nowhere to be found. The booth he had sat in was empty, though the waitress swore she had watched him walk toward the back door before the bell had rung. His coffee cup remained on the table, the liquid inside now stone cold, but the bag was gone. For days, whispers filled the town. Some said the man had been part of the old families, the ones who had lived here since the town's founding, before records were kept properly. Others swore he carried evidence of what had really happened during the fire that destroyed half the town square decades ago. The fire had always been explained as an accident, but deep down, many suspected there was more to it. The town rebuilt quickly, too quickly, and certain names disappeared from records, erased as if they had never existed. On the third night, more strange events began. Lights flickered in homes closest to the church. A dog howled relentlessly at shadows that no one else could see. In the cemetery behind the churchyard, fresh soil was found disturbed, though no burials had been scheduled. The caretaker insisted nothing had been touched, but his voice shook as he said it. By the end of the week, fear had settled in the bones of the townsfolk. The local sheriff tried to calm people down, holding a meeting in the old hall near the river. Lanterns cast long, flickering shadows on the walls as neighbors gathered, their voices rising with anger and fear. Some demanded answers about the bell, others accused each other of hiding the truth. The sheriff raised his hand for silence, and when the room finally grew quiet, he told them flatly that there were things in this town better left buried. His words hung in the air like a curse. But the younger ones weren't satisfied. A group of curious residents decided they had to see for themselves what the church was hiding. That night, under a cloudy sky that threatened rain, they crept into the churchyard with flashlights and nervous laughter that faded quickly into silence. The heavy wooden doors of the church groaned as they pushed them open, the stale smell of dust and mildew washing over them. Inside, the pews were covered in sheet. The strange death that defied all logic. It was late November in a quiet rural town in Virginia. The air carried the smell of burning wood from fireplaces, the skies darkened early, and long shadows stretched across the empty roads. People were preparing for the winter season, stacking firewood, closing shutters against the cold wind, and settling into their nightly routines. Nothing about the evening seemed unusual until a call came into the sheriff's office just after 10 at night. A man had been found dead inside his own home under circumstances so bizarre that even seasoned investigators would later describe it as one of the strangest cases they had ever seen. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? The house stood on the edge of town, an old two-story farmhouse that had been in the family for generations. Locals often passed by it and commented on its lonely appearance, the way the shutters rattled even when there was no wind, and how the light in the upstairs window sometimes flickered long past midnight. The man who lived there was known by many in town. He was not the type who kept close friends, but he was not disliked either. People described him as polite, quiet, and occasionally eccentric. No one ever expected his name to be tied to one of the most haunting investigations the county would ever face. The discovery was made by a neighbor who noticed that the man's truck had not moved for 2 days, and the porch light had been left on since the weekend. When no one answered repeated knocks on the door, the neighbor called authorities. Deputies arrived quickly, their flashlights cutting through the cold air as they walked up the creaking porch steps. The front door was locked. Yet when they pushed gently, it gave way with a strange groan, as if it had already been forced from the inside. The scene inside was unsettling from the start. The living room looked untouched, a stack of unopened mail sat neatly on the table, and the fireplace had gone cold. But as the officers moved deeper into the house, they were hit with a wave of unease. The air felt heavy, as if charged with something unseen. Upstairs, the hall was lined with old family portraits whose eyes seemed to follow the deputies' every step. They reached the bedroom at the end of the hall, and what they found there was unlike anything they had ever encountered. The man was lying on his bed, but not in the way one might expect. His body was arranged in a rigid, almost ceremonial position, arms crossed tightly over his chest, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling in frozen terror. His mouth was twisted into a silent scream, lips cracked as though he had been gasping for air. The blankets beneath him were undisturbed, tucked neatly under his body, suggesting he had not struggled or moved before death. It looked as if he had simply laid down and been struck by an invisible force that drained the life out of him instantly. The strangest detail was the expression on his face. It was not just fear, it was beyond fear. It was as if he had seen something impossible, something no human mind was meant to comprehend. The deputies stood frozen for a moment, their radios crackling softly in the stillness of the house. One of them whispered that it felt like the room itself was colder than the rest of the house, though there was no open window, no draft. When the coroner arrived, he too was baffled. There were no signs of injury, no blood, no evidence of a struggle. His heart had stopped, yet there were no natural causes found on initial inspection. His body temperature was strangely lower than expected, as if he had been dead far longer than he actually had. The coroner would later admit in private that he had never seen a face frozen in such an expression of horror. As the investigation unfolded, more details began to trouble the authorities. The man's phone was found on the nightstand, but its last call had been to 911. The disturbing part was that the call had gone through, yet when dispatch replayed the recording, all that could be heard was static, followed by a faint sound that some described as heavy breathing, while others insisted it sounded like faint whispers in the background. The call had lasted exactly 47 seconds before abruptly ending. Detectives searched the house for clues, but everything seemed in order. There was no sign of forced entry, no missing valuables, no fingerprints other than his own. It was as though death had entered the house unseen and left no trace behind. Some of the younger officers began whispering among themselves about the town's old legends. There had always been rumors that the land the farmhouse sat on carried a history of strange happenings, that years earlier there were stories of people hearing voices at night or feeling watched while walking near the woods behind the property. Most dismissed those tales as folklore, yet now, standing in the dimly lit bedroom, it was harder to ignore. The autopsy brought no clarity. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as cardiac arrest, but with no underlying condition to explain it. His organs were healthy, his blood work was normal, and there were no toxins detected. It was as if his body had simply decided to stop functioning, triggered by something unknown. What haunted those who saw the report was the conclusion written at the bottom: cause of death undetermined,